This is Gail Carriger, and oh, I'm really hoping this is working. The usual thing with me and technology, which is I'm so confused by it. Hi. Let me know if you're there and say hi. Leave a little message or something telling me where you're tuning in from if you would like. You don't have to fess up to that. But oh, I'm Gail Carriger. Today, I hope we're going to be talking about writing Nookie and romance and all those sorts of things. Oh yay, look, people are watching and people are signing in. This is very exciting. So yes, I did not start out as a romance writer. I think of myself as someone who writes romance. I don't know if I necessarily belong to the Romance Writer Club, but I do like to fraternize with them a lot. I hang out with my local romance writer collective and chapter, and some of my best friends are romance authors. So there's that. I have been to RWA back in the day, and I've done various romance author events. So that's how I am with the romance writer community. I pay very close attention to what they do because romance writers and authors tend to be quite cutting edge in terms of everything. Adopting self-publishing, adopting different platforms, experimenting with different technologies and things like that. So definitely I hang out with the romance authors. But I actually came up in the industry as a science fiction and fantasy author. That's where my original fandom was. That's where I was a fangirl. That's what I read growing up, etc. And so I was late to romance. I've always loved reading it, and I've always loved having it in my science fiction and fantasy. But one of the reasons I started to really explore writing romance is because I was scared of it. Like writing romance as the main narrative driver for some of my latter books, so books later on in my career. And that's just the Nookie scenes in particular I find very difficult and challenging to write. And I tend to believe, in order to keep life interesting, that you should lead or move in the direction that requires the most courage. And so for me, part of that was learning how to write romance and how to write sex scenes and how to do those well, or as well as I could to my own capacity, which usually means with funny bits in it and sexy bits. So yeah, so that was kind of my path to writing romance. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody out there who celebrates it. Happy Unvalentines to those who do not. I'll be your Valentine if you like. I have a mixed relationship with Valentine's Day, but all of the many, many, many times I've been single on Valentine's Day, I've always gotten together with another single friend and drunk champagne and eaten chocolate. So it's never really been a bad thing. It's always been a lot of fun, or I try to make it that way. So I hope I can help everybody make it that way today. I am here basically to answer any questions you might have about writing romance, about putting a romance thread in your book if you're a writer, or what it's like from the writer perspective to do that and give that kind of thing to readers. So yeah, I hope you'll have some questions for me. If not, I can ramble for a bit about more about what it's like to be somebody who fraternizes with romance, so to speak, which I guess is how I would put it for myself. I started out, those of you who read Solus does have some sex scenes in it. Maybe it's just really the one, but you may or may not notice in my early Parasol Protectorate stuff, which often has a romance chassis, don't be deluded, especially the first book, and by that I mean it uses the beats of a romance novel, if not necessarily is a romance novel. That in those sex scenes, I don't name any parts. I'm very sort of Victorian about it, so they're like kind of explicit, but also not explicit at all. The other cheat I use as an author is I always put a lot of humor into my sex scenes, and that's personal. I find sex amusing, so the sort of concept of it and the messiness of it and everything. So I like to play up the humor. It also sort of breaks the tension of the scene and lets me relax. Sometimes I'll have very sad sex scenes as well in some of my more adventurous stuff, like fifth gender or what have you. But the crutch of humor is one I lean on all the time, especially when I'm uncomfortable. I was joking on a recent podcast that I am the kind of person who laughs at a funeral. I know a lot of us have that tendency, but I genuinely will. So that I translate kind of discomfort and tension into comedy. And so I do that in my work as well. So you'll see that in my sex scenes. But in the Soulless and my earlier works, the Paranormal Protectorate, and then the Custard Protocol series, you'll see I'm sort of Victorianishly prudish about the sex scenes. So I kind of don't name parts. I kind of allude to things instead of being explicit, even though it's clear what's going on between the characters. So that's how I got away with it for a lot of my career. And then I just decided to start pushing myself since it did make me uncomfortable. I wanted to sort of explore why, and you got to see me exploring that on the page in some of the more explicit stuff. And I guess I really started being more explicit with this one, which is Sumage Solution. And you can tell I really wanted to push push boundaries. And with this book, and I signal markered that immediately by using a pen name. That's part of the reason I chose a pen name, was because this is going to be higher heat content, as we say in the biz. But also, if you start reading this book, I swear almost immediately. I start using blue language. And that was just me making sure readers knew immediately what they were in for with these books. So one way to indicate that you're going to be a little daring as an author and a little bit pushy as an author in terms of being explicit is to use explicit language. You can do that to indicate if you're going to be more gory than you would normally be as well, and things like that. Which is not to say that every books that use blue language are necessarily going to be explicitly sexual. It's just that was one of my little tricks to sort of let people know you're in a different arena from normal Gail. This is a different kind of story. We're going to go places we don't normally go. So I was sort of trying to give my readers a heads up with that. So those are kind of the two ways I've approached it. Then when I wrote Fifth Gender, where's the cover for that one? How prepared I am. Here it is. So then when I wrote this one, I really wanted to start super pushing the boundaries. So Poison or Protect kind of pushes the boundaries in terms of kink and things like that. But Fifth Gender really just is kind of wild and crazy in terms of the sex scenes and the characterization and everything. And I think that's because it's sci-fi, but I think also sort of sci-fi gives us license as authors to push the boundaries of everything when we write it. And a lot of early sci-fi authors did it to push the boundaries of, human existential existence and technology, but didn't really do it in terms of interpersonal relationships and sort of culture. The social sciences and were sort of left to the wayside in the golden age of sci-fi. So the 1950s saw a 1950s in space. They didn't see, in terms of what the culture was. And you have people like Heinlein who are pushing it a little bit, who thought, poly is a wild concept. And of course, sci-fi that's being written now will probably look very small and limited to future sci-fi authors, but that's the nature of the game. But all I was saying is that I kind of wanted and like using science fiction to also push the boundaries of romance and intimacy. And so Fifth Gender was me really sort of stretching those muscles for the first time as an author. So there's a little bit about me and my relationship as an author to sort of romance and sex. And now I'm going to scroll back and see if anybody's written me a question on the subject. As very nice people who are regulars to the live have already reminded you, please put a question mark at the beginning. And I will attempt to get you all. Okay, I'm scrolling through. I'm sorry. This is the challenging part of a Facebook Live when there are so many of you, which is flattering and lovely, but hard to keep track of. I am also using a new phone at the moment, and it's very sensitive. It's a delicate little thing. Rather like me these days. Lavender asks, so in regards to the required HEA, is that just for books marked as romance? How would I explain that? Okay, so for those of you unfamiliar with the romance genre as it now stands, so the term romance has a long and storied history. If you read The Heroine's Journey, I talk about the sort of the history of the romance genre quite a bit in that book. But essentially, romance, or this sentimental romantics, came out of the Gothics. And back in like the 1850s, right up until the turn of the century, even after, things could be labeled romance or sentimental romantic, or sentimental Gothic or romantic Gothic, and not end happily. In fact, a lot of times they ended tragically. That was part of the drama of it all. So the idea of romantic meant actually sort of more overblown sensibilities in terms of romantic relationships, and it indicated all of these Gothic tropes, many of which we've carried forward as a romance genre to the modern day. But what did change over the course of the history of the marketing of the different genres of commercial fiction is what it means to write romance. Now, if you label your book as romance, most of the time for most of the subgenres, and if you label your book as romance, you probably also pick a subgenre. So it's romance, but it's contemporary romance, it's small town romance, it's cozy mystery romance, it's sci-fi romance, etc. When you use that word romance, it means an HEA is guaranteed to the readers under most circumstances. HEA means happy ever after. The readers of the romance genre like that and expect it. So if you are not doing that as an author, you need to indicate that somehow in your cover art or in your blurb or in some way. Otherwise, the readers will be disappointed and they will be mad at you, the author, for having led them astray. Now, whether this is right or wrong is irrelevant to what has happened to the reader expectations as a result of marketing over the last 100 years. There's not a lot we can do to change that, so you have to work with it and work within it. Now, there are some subgenres, like urban fantasy, wherein a romance arc is expected, but it does not necessarily have to end happily in the first book or for the first couple. I'm thinking about something like Charlene Harris's works, where, you know, the character, it's more like a soap opera. The main character has like lots of different relationships through the course of the book. But that urban fantasy is different from something like paranormal romance. Paranormal romance, the readers of that genre expect there to be all the same sort of conceits as urban fantasy, but they expect a happy ending. Erotica doesn't necessarily have to end happily, and dark romance, and there's a couple of others that don't necessarily have to end happily. But by and large, to play it safe as an author, if you're going to bill yourself as writing romance, you probably need to end your book happily ever after, or at least the other option, which is something called happily for now. The readers really want that sort of sense of security and satisfaction and comfort at the end of the book. So that's how I would explain romance kind of as a market and as a marketing genre. And it's one of the reasons I personally associate myself with romance, both as a reader, as an author, because that's also something I do and really like to do and pay very close attention to in my standalones and in my series, which is I always like at least the main character to have a happy ending. And even if some of the side characters don't have that, I'll often then write a spin-off standalone novel or novella that gives those side characters a happy ending. So when Timeless came out and I just didn't have enough words or space or time or energy or point of view as flipping between characters to give Biffy and Lyle their happy ending, I always knew I was going to have to write them at the very least a short story. They got a long novella, short novel that gives them their happy ever after. That's romancing the werewolf. I eventually just wrote that for them. But that's kind of how I deal with my own, like, I want everyone to get a happy end. I want everyone to find their person or people. I want everybody to find that sort of sense of community and safety. And so for me as an author, I'm invested in the idea that is behind the market of romance, even if I don't necessarily always play into it. But I do always try to leave both my readers and my characters happier than they started out. Sarah asks, do I think paranormal romance is easier to write than normal romance? It depends on what you mean by normal romance. Urban fantasy and paranormal romance are not the same thing. So genre convention wise, in general, urban fantasy, the expectations are it's going to be what we would call a linked series. So you will not really understand book 2 if you haven't already read book 1. So you need to go through the series in order. They're linked. They have usually one or two main characters that carry throughout the urban fantasy series. So something like the Parasol Protectorate, right? That has some things in common with urban fantasy. Paranormal romance is written more like, if there's a series, a paranormal romance series, it's written a little bit more like romance authors tend to write series, which is with a sort of group of characters, say in a town somewhere or a werewolf pack or what have you, but it's a different main character or set of main characters in each book. So you can read them in order or you can read them out of order, but you can also expect your old favorites to show up in every book. So the way I wrote the San Andreas Shifters series, for example, is a paranormal romance style rather than an urban fantasy style, whereas the Parasol Protectorate series is written in an urban fantasy style. So those are just sort of baby conceits of the genre, essentially. So now back to your question, do I think paranormal romance is easier to read than normal romance? I think what you're asking, and you can clarify, Sarah, if this isn't it, and I'll come back to you, but I think what you're asking is contemporary romance. Contemporary romance dominates the romance genre. It's the most read subgenre. And it mostly means that the main characters live, act, and behave in the modern day. Now, there's lots of ways you can approach it. You can do an urban setting, you could do small town contemporary romance, you can do travel, cruise, contemporary romances, all that sort of thing. And then of course there's like suspense, mystery, all of cozies, all of those also kind of are tangential to contemporary. I tried to write contemporary romance. So when I started writing this, I thought, oh, I'll just do a contemporary romance. And instead it became a paranormal romance. And that is because I can't not do it, it turns out. At least at this point in my career. A magical system, supernatural creatures, science fiction elements are just absolutely integral to my voice as an author, and they leak in no matter what I do. It turns out that's what happens. It turns out I cannot dwell in reality as a creative. I have to dwell in something fantastical when I'm writing. And I think it's what I love. It's what I love to read. I read romance, but I still prefer sci-fi romance and fantasy romance and paranormal romance and urban fantasy. I read science fiction and fantasy the rest of the time. When I read YA, I strongly prefer fantastical elements in my young adult literature as well. I really don't read contemporary young adult. So yeah, it's just what I prefer both as a reader and a writer. So that's, for me, to answer your question, Sarah, it's just easier to write romance with a paranormal element because that's what I do. And I have tried, but I don't know that I ever could write contemporary, just what you would call regular or mainstream romance. Sue was asking how much research is done, into romance. A surprisingly enormous amount, into the sex scenes. Yes, I am absolutely one of those authors who has gone to a partner and been like, look, I just need to research whether this position will work. So we're gonna work that out. My partners have been universally pretty thrilled about this. So yeah. Somebody said, thank goodness I don't write about reality. That is the truth. And apparently the new interface jumps me to the end of the comments no matter what. Robert says, so I'm guessing Jude the Obscure doesn't qualify as HEA. I have never read Jude the Obscure. 9 times out of 10, if you ask me if I've read a piece of literature, like capital L literature, people would study it in university, I've probably not read it unless it was assigned during high school. So I have a comment from somebody who says, LaShonda says, I had never read anything like the San Andreas series, but that they trusted me as an author, and each character brought up emotions I wasn't expecting. As oh, thank you, LaShonda, that's very sweet. I'm so glad you gave them a try. I know there's a tall buy-in on the San Andreas Sifter series because it is explicit. And I realized I was going to be alienating some readers, and there are some readers that weren't going to be willing to follow me there. And for me as a writer, that's fine, and I hope for you as readers that's fine, because I'm always going to write you something more, and I'm always going to write you something new, and I never dwell too long in any one space. So, you know, like right now, I'm about to bring you a bunch of sci-fi. And most of it is young adult or new adult, so it's not going to be super sexy or explicit, although there is a romance thread in one of the ones that's upcoming. But that doesn't mean that the Parasolverse has been dropped. Those of you who only really like the Parasolverse, rest assured there will be more coming up. I never like leave you for too long and jump to another genre completely. I'm always going to try to keep circling around and coming back. And that's just me. I just like to explore these different things. I'm really grateful that you let me, that most of you are willing to give me being experimental and strange a try. Sally wants to know, what's my new phone? My new phone is an Apple. I am a slave to Apple. I'm sorry, we're talking tech really briefly. Sally is referring to me testing my tech in a different group earlier. It was crisis, everyone. Crazy times happened. Yeah, I'm a slave to Apple. I had an LC2 in high school, and I've always had Apple machinery and computer ever since. I'm just very comfortable with the UI. I'm embarrassed about this. It has worked both in my favor and against me over the years. So I don't know where I stand at this juncture, but there it is. So I am now the proud owner. My old phone, which is here, just started going absolutely crazy. My old phone is an iPhone 6. So I'm now the proud owner of an iPhone 12 mini, and that is what I am talking to you on. I can't tell you whether I'm happy with it or not, yet, but I can tell you I probably won't be happy with it for a very long time, because that's how I am with new technology. Right now, many of you will know from the continuing saga of Gail and technology that I had to, due to a tea spillage incident, get a brand new laptop. I'm still using both the new laptop after 6 months or whatever it's been, and the old laptop, which is mostly broken, but still does a couple of things that the new laptop just won't do. And so now, the result of getting a new laptop just means I'm carrying 2 laptops around with me everywhere. This is so typical. I can't even tell you. So as you can tell, I'm carrying 2 phones around with me everywhere right now too, because I just got a new phone. I'm terrible. I'm a terrible tech person. Yeah, you'd think I didn't grow up near Silicon Valley. I did, but I also used to like debug software and stuff. But honestly, that was a great job for me because I can break any technology. Just leave me in the room with it for 5 minutes and it's done. It's like a special superpower. And I don't even require tea half the time to spill on it. Eddie asks, can I ask another question like, what day am I going to be at the convention? I don't have my schedule. Eddie is asking, I think, about Tucson. So I'm going to be in Tucson for the Steampunk Wild Wild West Con, which is a first for me. Usually I'm on writing retreat during this convention, but they were off scheduled by a week this time around. So quite a bit of travel about to start. But I don't have my schedule for that yet. In classic convention style, we often don't know what we're doing, when, where, why, and how until like 3 or 4 days before the event starts. It's pretty typical, actually. But they have me booked for the day before to the day after, so they have access to me the entire time, and my contract requires me to be present for all day, every day, on site. So you should be seeing a lot of me. If you can't find me at a me thing or at a book booth or in a book-related activity area, look for me with Madame Askew and the Grand Arbiter and the tea people. I'm always hanging out with them. That's pretty much, I was like, I'll do Tucson if you'll do Tucson. So you can look for me there. Look for me at tea dueling, tea racing, all the like tea tangential activities. Honestly, to be fair, that's pretty much where you could always find me at any event. Is there tea? Gail will be in proximity to the tea. Not today though, actually. I had coffee earlier, hence the slightly hyperactivity. So I'm drinking water at the moment, like a good girl. Coffee just affects me differently than tea. It makes me a little cuckoo. I'm already cuckoo, but it makes me a little bit more than cuckoo. Natalie asks, did the early sci-fi fanfics heavily affect the romance genre, to my knowledge? This is very interesting. So I hang out with a little discussion mastermind group that actually just talks about tropes, specifically romance tropes, but we also talk about other tropes. And by that I mean like really sort of simple, basic, everyday tropes, like there's only one bed, aka the proximity trope, or cohabitation trope. But also like broader, bigger tropes, like, you know, like quest narrative elements in romance or something like that. And so your question, did early sci-fi fanfics heavily influence? I think what you're talking about is like the first slash. So the history of fanfic is, so far as I'm aware, it's not my fandom, but I do keep a very close eye on it. Pretty much this idea of slash fic and like Mary Sue and all those sorts of things began with sci-fi, most specifically original Star Trek. But a lot of other fanfics spawned out of early sci-fi pieces. It's now also fantasy and a bunch of other stuff, of course. Fanfic is now a thriving community. I actually think, I'm sure there are a couple of PhD theses on fanfic at this point in time, especially since the Harry Potter fanfics sort of blew up. And especially since a lot of like big name authors have come out of the fanfic universe. And movie adaptations and things have been born from congealed what used to be fanfic of one IP got stripped. So there's something called IP stripping, where you can take a piece of work that is associated with an IP, sometimes a piece of work that had been commissioned and then is rejected or whatever. You can strip the IP out of it, the intellectual property. So say somebody writes a work for hire piece for Star Wars. They can actually, and the Star Wars people don't want it or decide against it or something. You can strip the Star Wars IP out of it, put it in your own manufactured sci-fi universe and resell it. So the term stripping IP comes from that. There have been fanfics over the years where they've been IP stripped. So say it was a fanfic for Harry Potter. We all probably know what book I'm referring to if you're familiar with the YA genre. Was essentially IP stripped and then repackaged and sold. So, but it did start life as a fanfic, and there are quite a few authors who either have written fanfic semi-professionally, or came out of writing fanfic and transitioned to quite healthy romance or YA usually careers. Why am I talking about this in answer to this question? Because I think there are definitely tropes and genre conventions that come out of fanfic. And I think, especially amongst millennials and younger, there are readers who grew up reading fanfic who have expectations of the romance genre in particular, but other genres as well, that were established by fanfic. And I think a very smart, especially a cinematically focused author, pays attention to what's going on in that particular arena, because that's where new taste is being born. Not necessarily trends, but definitely taste. in addition to writing styles, I think any author now who really wants to serialize, in the romance genre in particular, should be borrowing tips and tricks from fanfic. I think the best serializers are writing on Tapaz and Radish and Wattpad and places like that, where your bandwidth is paid back to you. Your fandom is paid out to you by people being excited to get the next installment. That training as an author is an instrument of pacing, which most romance authors struggle with the most, how to pace something properly. It's really hard to pace a piece that is based almost entirely on kind of internal emotions. You know, fantasy and sci-fi and the other commercial subgenres, the commercial genres, they all have plot and, you know, exploding things and this and that you can do to really like be an instrument of pace. Romance has to have has the romantic connection as the mainstay narrative driver, and therefore pacing can be a problem. And so if you learn to write serialized, which is what most fanfic is, you learn to solve pacing problems naturally and innovatively, if you're good, if you're one of the better fanfic authors. So all of that to say, as someone who's only read maybe half a dozen pieces of fanfic in her life, what I think there's some very admirable things that are being done there. And more importantly, I think there are very innovative things being done there that a smart author studies and thinks about utilizing. Probably an author younger than me and more innovative than me. But yes, I think fanfic has heavily influenced the romance genre, and I think it's going to be more influential in the romance genre in particular going forward, because I think a lot of romance is transitioning to serialized formats. Perhaps not on Vella, but definitely on other platforms and definitely outside of the United States. So that was very much industry specific. I hope you guys don't mind. I have thought about serialization myself. I'm not sure if my skill set is there, but I'm very interested in it as a writer technique because of its influence on pacing. And I've talked about this before, but I always worry about pacing. As somebody who writes essentially comedies of manners, which is what I tend to really write, pacing is also a problem that I need to think about a lot, and learning how to serialize can help solve that problem. Tivani, please excuse me if I don't pronounce that right, asks, how do I write erotic scenes for characters with a different gender, anatomy, and preference than my own? That's a very good question, especially with aliens. A very, very healthy imagination is helpful with the aliens for and research into animal sexual activities that are perhaps a little less human, shall we say. So we'll put that to one side. So research is another one. So there are some excellent erotica and otherwise authors right there, out there, who are writing from an own voices perspective. So I like to read those to get inspiration. I am also extremely experienced with most genders and personally. And also I have a lot of friends in the queer community. So if I'm specifically writing from a perspective that's entirely not my own, then those are all sensitivity read to make sure I'm not offending anybody or getting anything glaringly wrong. So that's how I do it. So lots of research, talking, asking questions, reading things, that sort of stuff. Yeah, that's how I do it. Oh, and sleeping with lots of people, that helps. Chris asks, how do I research, so this is a similar question, how do I research male or gay sex scenes to make sure it feels authentic? Hang out with a lot of gay boys who talk to me, will tell me things in detail if I ask. Very helpful. Many of them quite happy to be then alluded to in print. Jennifer asks, what's my favorite way to transition into a Nookie scene? Ooh, that's a very good question. Honestly, I don't know that I give this very much thought. So how do I go from just like a date to the bedroom? honestly, it just happens. Like, my characters want to sleep with each other, they want to sleep with each other, they're just like moved that way. There's a lot, I mean, I'm a dialogue heavy author, so I can put a lot of like sexual innuendo and flirting and stuff beforehand, so that kind of clues both the characters and the reader that it's going to happen. I like consent, so like I do flirtatious consent, so like often the sex scenes are kind of set up because they're sort of a little bit of negotiated, to use the kink term, ahead of time. So that's kind of part of it, I guess. Yeah, I don't like the sex scenes, any sex scenes that have sort of happened in my books have happened really organically. So I don't really plan them out that much. The transition, I mean, they just end up there. I got randy characters, what can I say? They horny. How much research is done for the books? I think that, I answered that one. A lot of research sometimes not. I should say, I research fight scenes as well. So, various partners and friends over the years, I've been like, what happens if you come up behind me and try to strangle me like this? Like, how do I break away? You know, especially when I was writing the Finishing School series, I'd be like, so there's a lot of me getting physical with the people in my lives in order to write scenes for you. We all suffer, everybody. We suffer for my art. This is the consequence of being friends with an author. Or lovers with an author. Like, you know. Do I prefer fade to black? Charity, this is a very good question from Charity. About preference. Well, like I said, I started writing more explicit Nookie and sex scenes because I was scared of them and I wanted to challenge myself. So that was one of the primary reasons to start writing that. Now I kind of enjoy it. But sometimes it just really works better for the story if there's a fade. So like sometimes the characters are just like, yeah, get your nose out of our business, you're leaving us. And my current work for my current WIP, my current work in progress, is this situation where like I actually had some pretty good sex scenes for these main characters, but the main characters were kind of like, no, that's not really germane to our arc. We don't need that put on screen, so to speak. So it's pretty clear as these books go along that these characters are sleeping with each other. But the lens of the narrative doesn't really follow them behind the closed doors. So it's a little bit more of a fade to black. They're extremely emotional, these books. So like the sex scenes are kind of alluded to in the background sometimes because the emotional resonance of what's going on is in the foreground and that's driving the narrative. But that was just what these main characters wanted from me. It was just how they, or the one, my POV character, it's kind of how he's telling this narrative, because there's only one POV. Honestly, if it were flipping to the other love interest POV, we would probably get more sex scenes, because that's just their personality. But in this particular instance, it's not. So yeah, often it's the characters who tell me what they want now. Now that I'm more comfortable writing explicit, the character and the story. Like sometimes the story is just like, we don't need to go there, or sometimes the story is like, we gotta go there. Like I want to visit what happens in the bedroom. So it's really just germane to the kind of voice and the feel of the narrative for me. Jameson asks, is it easier if the Nookie happens off camera then? For me, it used to be, but now it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the others. Like I said, it really depends on the story. Like I started writing the sex scenes for these characters that I'm writing right now, and they were hard to write, and that was one of the indications that maybe these characters don't like that. It's not for them. It's not for these books. Okay, we're back to Sarah's question, so now I can move ahead. This is great. Everybody is sticking to the topic. I really appreciate that. Makes it more fun for watchers later if like there's just one big subject for the whole talk. We are 45 minutes in, so I have about 15 minutes to ask any final questions you might have. So get those in now, and then we'll stop and I'll try and hit them all up before we end. Nether regions. Yes, I have used some very old-fashioned terms for parts when I have used parts in the Victorian books, just because they're silly words or ridiculous. And you know me, I never met a silly word I didn't want to try to shoehorn into a book. Moving along. I'm sorry, just doing the scrolling thing. Sometimes I hum. Apparently I'm not feeling very hummy today. The comments are very funny here on Facebook, I have to say. There's some very hilarious, like, worst sex scenes ever written each year. I'm trying to remember what the name of it is. It's like an award that's given out for, like, serious literary works that just contain terrible sex scenes. It's one of my challenges often. So when people criticize the romance genre, I'm always like, well, you know, you're participating in 200 years of misogyny. Good for you. Would you like to read a book on the subject called The Heroine's Journey? But that's one thing. The other thing that happens when someone criticizes romance is I say, you try and write a really good sex scene. Because let me tell you, that there are two things I find incredibly challenging to write. And that is a sex scene and humor. Interesting that I've mostly built my books on these things, but yeah. My friend Dan always says a good fight scene, one-on-one, and a good battle sequence, huge army against huge army, also very difficult to write. And I would agree, I just don't write those as often. But yeah, a good sex scene is really hard to write. And honestly, you can't learn how to write them if you don't read good romance. Because the best written sex scenes out there are in the romance genre. So if you want to use a sex scene in your book, no matter what you write, I genuinely believe you need to have read some romance. It's just where the best of the best is right now. Robert asks if I read older science fiction, such as John Wyndham. I don't really read a lot of the old stuff. I read a little bit back in the day when you could run out of sci-fi at the library. Back in the day when there was no sci-fi really written by women, and I had read it all. So we're talking like the late 80s and the early 90s. Or I read all that I had access to in the English language. So yeah, then I read some of the older sci-fi. I really don't like it. I'm sorry. What can I say? Most of the time I just don't like it. Asimov I found okay to consume in audio. Mostly I just prefer his short stories. I really find his longer stuff quite dull. I'm terrible in terms of sort of the history of the genre and all genres in general. I don't love the older romances. I don't love the older fantasies either. I read Tolkien. I will never read Tolkien again. I think I had the patience for it at the time because I was 10 and I didn't know better. You know, and I love the movies and everything, but I'm not gonna, it's a slog. I find it a slog. I don't like to work too hard to read something. I'm a lazy reader. Sorry. Not sorry, really. Like, we all have our own taste. You read what you like. Eddie asks how many books I'm willing to sign at one sitting. I have historically signed every book I've written in one sitting, which at the time was maybe about 20 books and now would be about 30, 35 books. Depends on whether you have all of the editions and like the CDs and stuff like that. But I figure I wrote it. I better be willing to sign it. But also, you came to see me in person. I will do what I can to make you happy. I mean, I'm a freaking author. You don't have to see me in person. I'm a writer. So the fact that you like thought I was important enough to come see in person, I take very seriously. I think so I'll sign it all. Sometimes when I'm doing a signing at like a convention, this won't happen, I don't think, at Wild Wild West Con, but you know, people will trundle up with suitcases of books for me to sign. And usually the convention will make you just get the first 3 signed and then go back to the back of the line and wait until everyone else has had something signed first, so that, you know, I don't overgo my time slot, and so other people don't have to wait in line for a really long time. And like bookstores will do that too. But, you know, and some bookstores are just awesome. Like, University Bookstore in Seattle stayed open like an additional hour and a half so I could sign extra stuff. So, because there was a bigger turnout than they were expecting for that particular event. And so, and I'm willing to stay longer and sign, so they were willing to keep the store open. So yeah, it depends on the venue is the answer most of the time, but generally speaking, if it's up to me, I'm gonna do my best to sign everything you brought, because you came to see me. This is still a miracle to me, okay? It's still amazing that there are people watching this live, that like people want to meet me. I don't know. It's just, I'm 12 years into this and I'm still genuinely startled by the love. Like, this is Valentine's Day. We should be talking about this kind of love too, I guess, which is like, you pour love into me as readers, and like, I'm not insensitive to that, I swear. I can't get over it most of the time. I appreciate it so much. Look, I'm tearing up. Jessica asks, do I handwrite before I type? Not really. I don't write longhand. I have a very few author friends who write longhand. My dear friend Kristen Kishore, who some of you might know, she's the author of Graceling, among others. Last time we talked, she was still writing longhand. I can't imagine. I used to have this massive callus on my finger from writing longhand, but it's been so long since I've written longhand that the callus has faded. I do write notes, so I'll handwrite notes quite a bit, but they're usually kind of like in the shower notes or little thought process notes, so it's like 8 sentences or a little club together dialogue for an upcoming scene or something. Those will be handwritten, often in the middle of the night, occasionally in the shower. I have a wet note thing, which is a pencil and a pad that works in the shower. And then I have a couple notebooks lying about. So like, here's my current fancy notebook. So, and they'll just have random notes in it. But that's pretty much all I write longhand now. How do I choose which explicit language and terms I use for erotic scenes? This is a very interesting question, Dee, because it is something I think about, and I think it's something a lot of romance authors who write higher heat levels do think about. Those of us who write things more explicit, like, exactly, like, not to be crass, I don't want an explicit rating on YouTube, so I won't say the words, but anatomically correct terms for parts, or eluded terms for parts, or slang terms for parts, or dirty word terms for parts. Like, which do you use? The answer is, it's kind of dictated by the point of view character. So, like, Max in this series has a real potty mouth, and so do his sex scenes. Because his thought process when you're writing what in the romance genre is called deep point of view, or deep POV, is dictating the language that I am using as a narrator. And so it's bluer and dirtier and more explicit because he's like that as a character. That's kind of his personality. Whereas in the same book, the scenes that are from Brian's perspective, or Beth's perspective, his love interest, who's reserved and a lot more private, are similarly reserved and a lot more private. Also, Brian is from the East Coast and Max is from the West Coast, and so they have different slang and they rely on different, like, dirtinesses and dirty words. So, so that affects, so the origin of the character also affects what language that I am using as the narrator. In general, my perspective as a writer is to pick the words that are least likely to jar my readers. So I don't often use anatomically correct language because readers don't like it. They just don't respond well to the kind of words that would be used when you're visiting a physician. Now, if I'm writing a physician or a medic or a hospital kind of care, or a doctor character, I might use anatomically correct terminology. If they were sort of an analytical kind of personality who's likely to do that. And especially if I could make it be funny in those scenes. So I don't rule it out entirely, but you will very rarely see me use the like textbook words for parts. I will usually try to come up with some other thing that's either a sexier term, a euphemistic term, a dirty term, or a slang term, and those choices will be dictated by the characters involved in the scene and by the characters' experience levels and sort of personalities and everything. Facebook has helpfully skipped things. Oh, I'll just... smut is another good word I haven't used. Right, so I'm going to have to approach some of these backwards at this juncture, but I think I'm going to say stop asking questions now. So Jessica's question is going to be the last one I take. I'm going to do it now and then work backwards. Last one I take on the list. Do I worry about using the same word or phrase in romance writing multiple times? And do you have a way to solve that issue that doesn't include a thesaurus? I worry about using multiple words multiple times, regardless of whether it's a romance or a sex scene or anything. It is something I think about a lot. Generally speaking, if I'm using word repetition, it's intentional in a sentence. So you'll see me use the same word in multiple sentences specifically for emphasis, because I'm interested in the sing-song nature of language. So it's almost a poetical application when I am using a repeat, which means that I try not to repeat word usage too frequently within the same paragraph or even on the same page to avoid unnecessary emphasis. So I don't want it to be emphasized. Sorry, that's a little technical. But yes, so I think about repetition in vocabulary a lot. Writers also talk about something called writer's tics, and that's when you have specific vocabulary words or sentence structures that you lean into a little too hard. Most of us don't even realize we have the tics. Usually a copy editor has to catch them for us. Occasionally we learn about them and self-correct. Sometimes we self-correct too far in the other direction. So I used to use the word rather all the time. Now I don't think I've actually used the word rather without really thinking about it for 6 years or something, because I was so paranoid about it because it was such a tic for me that I just cut it completely out of my vocabulary as a writer. So that's writer's tics, which are another thing that we do have to think about as authors. In terms of not using a thesaurus, I do use a thesaurus. Partly that is because I often know there's a word I'm looking for that's a better word than I'm using, but I can't remember what it is because I'm getting old and my brain's very sieve-like. And the English language has a lot of vocabulary in it. So yeah, I use a thesaurus quite a bit. I use other human thesaurusi as well. So if I'm writing virtually or in person with another writer, I'll often look up and be like, what's the word for the cold square thing in the kitchen where you keep the food? Because I have forgotten the word refrigerator, because I do that sometimes. And I'll do the same thing for like, wait, what's the word for blah, 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 and then they'll help me out because sometimes the thesaurus fails me. So yeah, I use a thesaurus is the answer. There are some, I also collect, for the Parasolver stuff, I collect vintage slang and dirty words so that I have access to funny terms for everything, not just sex or sexual acts, but like being drunk and that sort of stuff. Also, I'm a comedic author, so I am permitted by the Universe Collective of Literati to make up my own ridiculous words for things if I want to, and often I do. So that's my other solution, is just to come up with my own new ridiculous word for a thing. Have done that quite a bit too. I'm glad there are some nice compliments in the comments. I appreciate it. Amanda asks, do I plan out romance scenes ahead of time, or do I just let things come as I write? Since you mentioned my current word project has scenes for Fade to Black. So romance scenes for me and sex scenes for me work very much like other scenes, which is occasionally I will see a scene that's in the future for the current book I'm working on. And I will then write that scene down and write towards it linearly during my regular writing time, and eventually like meet up that scene, so to speak. So I will occasionally have sex scenes for characters, like in my current project, that I haven't written them to that point in their relationship yet, but I kind of know what their first sex scene is going to be like, for example. And so I'll write towards it. In this particular instance, I had about 3 sex scenes that I just came up with early on in writing these books, but it's a very slow burn romance arc. There are 3 books in the series I'm currently writing. Characters don't really start monkeying around with each other until the second half of the second book. And so I came up with some of the sex scenes while I was writing the first book. So I always knew, the thing about that, when you're writing that far, when you come up with a scene that's that far ahead, is you have to acknowledge to yourself as an author that it might never work, that it might just be inspiration, that the book might have changed substantially by the time you get there, that it no longer fits. And these were kind of like that. So they're good sex scenes, they work for the characters, but they just don't work for the narrative. I might actually put them together and kind of offer them as an extra to my newsletter, to the share people, after the books have come out. So like if you want to follow these 2 characters behind the scenes, you can, a little bit like writing my own slash or writing my own fanfic. So that's kind of one of the possible things I might do with those scenes. But yeah, in that particular instance, that's what was going on. But so there are some romance and sex scenes that are like that, and then there are other romance and sex scenes that are planned as part of the narrative. So I am mostly an outliner, and I do mostly know when I need to hit certain romance beats to satisfy romance readers, because I'm aware that I do have quite a few readers who have come to me from the romance genre specifically and would describe themselves as romance readers. They have certain expectations, and those expectations are based almost in the sort of heartbeats of books. And so in order to satisfy them, I have certain points in the narrative where I know a certain amounts of intimacy should be established and connection should be hit, especially in the standalones. So in like these ones, so in the novellas, like these books, this one not so much because it's a different style of romance, the sort of reunion romance, but something like this, like How to Marry a Werewolf, is a pretty classic kind of romance chassis that the beats are built on in this book. And so I have an outline that has those elements in it, but also other elements of story and narrative that I want to hit, and how they balance against those romance beats in terms of sort of plot drivers, world reveals, character reveals, those kinds of things. So the answer is not very satisfying, Amanda, I'm afraid, which is sometimes they're inspired ahead of time and sometimes they are absolutely planned out, my romantic scenes. Now, the actual individual actions within the characters in the scenes are not usually planned out. Those chiefly arrive from the inspiration of the moment. I think that's an Austen quote. Could be Dickens, but anyway. An embarrassment of riches, says Clay. I'm sorry, I'm reading your commentating backwards. And so I don't know what you guys are talking about, but I'm just looking for questions. Last of the questions. It looks like I might... someone else remembers running out of the library options experience. It looks like I might have hit everyone's questions about writing romance in the romance. Robert is mentioning a contest I've never heard of before, so I don't have to answer that question. Oh, Katie has a question. Have I ever had a character turn out to be ticklish? Katie, what an interesting question. I think we're going to end on this question. I apologize now if I have missed anybody's question. You should feel free to ask me again at any time. Drop me a calling card via my website if you would like to get your question answered personally, or show up for the next live and I will try to answer it then. I'm sorry, I'm terrible about catching them all. I will never win at Pokemon Go. Katie's question, ticklish characters. I shouldn't I? But you know what? I'm not ticklish. And so I don't think in terms of ticklishness which I really should. I should have a character who's ticklish, or two. But yeah, I kind of don't really know what it's like to be ticklish. So that is one life experience that I don't really have a lot of association with. I should try to imagine what that is like, but that's really hard for me to imagine. It's really hard for a ticklish person to imagine non-ticklishness and vice versa, I guess. But yeah, this girl, not ticklish. Never really have been, even as a kid. So there's that. Interesting facts about Gail upon which we are ending. Thank you all very, very much for showing up today. Look, my new phone lasted on battery the whole time. It's a miracle. I'm so excited about that fact. Thank you all for being my Valentines. I appreciate it very, very much. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the month. I will hopefully have a live for you next month. Might be a little wonky schedule-wise, because I'm traveling quite a bit. And we didn't even mention it, but we should mention it, shouldn't we? Those of you who saw your email this morning, you got to see this, which is the new cover. Gail remembers that she actually is a writer and has a book coming out. There it is. So this is Crud Rat. It's going to be out April 1st. This year. It already exists in audio, but it's getting its print and digital release finally. So check your inboxes, and I'll see you next month. Bye, everybody.